Welcome to the final Res New Zealand Symposium. My name is Anne Hood and I'm CEO of Res New Zealand. Today our topic is resettlement and I'm delighted to welcome Rachel O'Connor and Tayyaba Khan. We'll begin our conversation with a 40-minute discussion and followed by Q&A. There's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to put your questions in there and we'll get to them as soon as we can. So Rachel has a long involvement in the refugee sector. She is currently the New Zealand Red Cross General Manager for Migration, which involves managing several national migration programs. These include Pathways to Settlement, Pathways to Employment, the Refugee Trauma Recovery Service, and Restoring Family Links. Tayyaba is founder and CEO of the Khadija Leadership Network and New Zealand Ambassador for the European Muslim League. She has over 15 years experience working in the migrant and refugee sector in Palestine, the UK, Australia, and in New Zealand as the CE of Changemakers Refugee Forum. So thank you both so much for being with us today, and thank you for your support of RAS. Let's get into the questions. I'm interested in how decisions are being made about where quota refugees are resettled in New Zealand. What is Immigration New Zealand's consultation process around decision making? How are refugee communities, local communities, councils and iwi involved? Rachel, maybe we'll kick off with you, and Tayyaba, please join us with any comments.
Yeah, sure. Kia ora everybody, and thanks for the nice introduction, Anne. In terms of decision making about where refugees are resettled in New Zealand, we've just, I guess, recently seen quite an interesting process that immigration has gone through as they've identified the new settlement locations for increasing the quota. And certainly what they did in terms of identifying that, it was really a government-led decision at the start where a number of government agencies identified potential settlement locations and they went through a process of identifying where there was capacity, and then immigration led the conversations with city councils to start with, but also included iwi in conversations, other settlement providers and that sort of side of things. So the decision has largely been at the government level, but we've seen over the last year immigration, I guess, widen the net of people who are involved in that. And that's been quite an interesting process, because in the past that hasn't been the case. It's often just been a dialogue between government and often ourselves as the settlement provider. But for the first time, you're seeing iwi come up to the Mangere Refugee Centre and receive orientation and be part of the discussion. So it's definitely widening in terms of who's involved and maybe not so much the decision itself, but certainly the conversation has widened in terms of who's part of that, who's part of it.
Tayyaba, have you got any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, look, I just I want to talk about what Rachel said. In terms of this being quite new, that we've got a system now where more people are allowed to have an input, and it's fantastic to see New Zealand. And that's really, really important. I do think, though, that actually, in terms of decisions, we're not quite there yet. So, though people are consulted, and certainly refugee communities are also consulted as a part of this process, there's a gap there in terms of whether they're at the table for the decisions that get made. So my understanding is that it's predominantly led by agencies like Housing New Zealand, Red Cross, which isn't a government entity, but a critical organisation in this whole entire process, and then Immigration New Zealand. So we're still, even in government at large, there are very few bodies who are at the decision-making table.
I'm going to keep moving us along because we've got quite a few things to get through. So you've both been working in the sector for many years. In your experience, what are some of the key resettlement issues for newly arrived refugees? And what about the longer term issues for people who've been settled here for some time?
You can kind of start with, some of the things that are not unexpected. It can be incredibly challenging if you're brand new to overcome language barriers. There's local orientation you need to get around, meeting neighbours, even just the weather can be a massive challenge. I remember one day, you know, we had a family in the office, and you know, it was one of those 4 seasons in one day kind of New Zealand weather day, and the father turned to me and just sort of said, "What season is this?" You know, it was we just, you know, gone from raining to sun, and you know, and everything like that. So you know, there's all the things that if you're new in a country, I think it's just incredibly challenging. And you know, you can have family dynamics have completely changed. You know, just housing is massive. You know, if you're going into low income housing, the challenges that people have to face around, you know, being in sometimes a cold house, you know, is really, really significant. And so there's lots of that kind of challenge. I think the challenge that I wasn't expecting when I first started getting involved in the work is just how lonely people can feel in those early days, that, you know, they've come into a brand new country and they're very grateful that they're in a house and safe and everything like that, but you don't know anybody, and your family might be overseas and might be unknown, and you haven't got those networks. And you know, sometimes in the early days, that's what we hear a lot from people, is just that sense of feeling disconnected and lonely and not quite sure what to do yet, you know. So it takes a while for those connections to build. But you know, things like transportation, you wouldn't expect it, but can be incredibly difficult for people. You know, there was somebody I know who needed to get to a doctor's surgery, and you know, she was trying to navigate the bus and trying to speak in English and trying to manage the money, and it was just all too much. And we got a phone call from the bus driver saying, you know, there's a woman on my bus crying, and all she can do is give me your business card, you know. And the thought of going to a counselling session, let alone trying to manage the money, try to figure which bus stop you get off, you know, it's overwhelming when you're brand new in a country, trying to take in so much new information. And of course, as we know, often once you're in safety, you get that opportunity to start processing what's happened before. So you've got all of that going on as well. So, you know, it's an incredibly difficult journey for anybody to do.
Mm. Tayyaba, what about your thoughts?
I really appreciate, Dr. Anne, you separating out the newly arrived versus the longer term issues that do exist. So look, for me, what I've kind of seen in the New Zealand context, language is a significant one, which Rachel touched on. I mean, it's how we communicate with each other, it's how we understand each other. And so it's pretty significant that, you know, when people arrive, the first thing that they need to kind of get a handle on is language and how they communicate with those around them. The second that I've noticed is, you know, and also something that Rachel has already touched on very, very briefly, is cultural adaptations, especially if it is challenging yours, so the culture you have come from. And, you know, interesting example to use around the bus, because there are people who are coming to New Zealand from countries where there are no road signs. And so to learn systems like that can be very, very overwhelming. And of course, evolving identity issues, particularly in relation to your faith. So you might come here, you might have people from your own country here, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the people that are going to make you feel safe, because in your home country, where you've kind of, you know, where you've been kind of persecuted, the issues might be around different faith practices or political persecution. So you might not necessarily, you know, go to your own ethnic-based communities to build your social connections. It can be very, very challenging. And then, of course, nestling into the basics for the newly arrived. So, you know, getting a home that's actually comfortable, job that is to your satisfaction, connecting with schools if you have kids, and then going on to social connections. So I think those are, for me, they've been the highlights of what happens for newly arrived refugees. But longer term issues, look, housing continues to be a significant one for us here in New Zealand, and we definitely need to create spaces where we talk about that in a much more practical and accessible context. And of course, I was reading the longer term settlement of refugees, the report that was released, and it, you know, has the staggering fact of how 16% in the study owned or partly owned their homes. And the study was done with about 513 participants. So 16% is quite low. And last but not least, employment. So even if you've been here for a long time, employment remains an issue. And I think that's got to do with, well, I know that's got to do with institutional racism, transitioning into employment or a sector that might not have been your sector in your home country, and predominantly being in labouring roles, and the dissatisfaction that might come with that, especially if you were a professional back home.
Wonder if I can just build on what Tayyaba was saying there about those social connections, you know, in terms of, because I think I touched on it early on around, you know, it can be really difficult in those very early days, but also that long-term social connection is really hard. And there's some interesting research around how the experiences of what you kind of call like friendly interactions actually helps people feel safe and secure. So, you know, somebody, you're brand new to the country, or, you know, you even if you've been around for a little bit, that experience of having friendly interactions with others, whether it's your neighbour, it helps you build that sense of safety and security, which is what we saw in the aftermath of March 15, you know, people talking about, particularly our Muslim whānau, who were talking about people greeting them and you know, being friendly on the street, and how that actually helped rebuild some of that sense, also, you know, some of that sense of being safe and after what had just been shattered, you know, in terms of the March 15 events. And then there's this kind of second part that around, you know, friendliness helps you feel safe and secure, but actually having equal interactions is actually what builds or determines quality of life. And so I think some of those challenges and that longer space for people is needing to get past that friendliness where you're establishing a sense of safety and security, but actually we need to have equal interactions. And I think that can often be a challenge for people in settling long term. How do you get to have really strong relationships that are equal, that bring quality of life in as well? So, I mean, the amount of people I've met who've been here for a long time and they've never had dinner at a, you know, Kiwi's home or that sort of side of things, you know, that can be a real challenge to that integrating and participating in a meaningful way. And that's really where the responsibility of host community comes in as well.
Yeah, we're going to touch on that topic. I'd quite like to talk a little bit about this longer term settlement process, because what we know is currently the refugee resettlement process really focuses on the first 6 months. But we know that it's a much longer process than that, and sometimes it can take years. How would you like to see support rolled out over a longer term, and what difference do you think this would make?
Who wants to go first on that one? We can rebuild
let's go for it. Let's rebuild the whole strategy.
I can start. So look, I actually think it's really important that we have formalized mechanisms of representative and inclusive consultation, which I understand is difficult to achieve with so much ethnic diversity that makes up the you know, former refugee population, but really, really critical. So for organizations to advocate for this in government and within their own policies and processes, I think that's really essential for us to make sure that people are part of the process in that way. Following on from that, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, I suppose, my experience here, having worked in the sector, and the need for us to really build conflict resolution initiatives as part of the longer term resettlement approach. You know, we understand that there's a lot of toxicity within the sector between communities and so forth, and we need to be providing better tools for better communication to resolve these issues so that people do feel safe and that they feel connected. And those conflicts can arise for a number of reasons, you know, whether that's based on race or religion or tribe, or so I think it's really important that as a sector we start thinking more broadly. And the last point that I think for me is really important to see for future New Zealand as well is we need organisations training and deeply immersed in CQ practices. I think it would help to build our social capital and that sense of connection of former refugees, rather than what we see happen. And we've seen it. I mean, I've certainly seen it happen over the last 2 decades in New Zealand, where people feel that they would thrive more when they move to Australia, that they will have better community connections as a result of it. So we need to figure out this missing piece of the puzzle as to why we can't achieve that right here on our shores.
Have you got any theories why we're not achieving that, Tayyaba?
For me, and I am really not speaking about this from an academic research-based perspective, so I want to lead in with that proviso. And this is just lived experience. I think we've got a lot of smaller communities who don't necessarily, interact with each other. And certainly that's been, as of late, we've had the opportunity to interact with the Indigenous community, and that's fantastic. But what that's meant is that we've got these long-standing views, these conflicts that emerge every now and then. And I think that's an issue we avoid because it's a soft issue. We don't need to deal with that because we need to deal with the housing and the schooling and the employment first and foremost before we think about the softer issues of people getting along, so social cohesion. But social cohesion needs to almost come first for people to feel like they're thriving in the society that they live in now. I think if we did that, if we made people feel safe in that way, we would have less of this migration pattern to Australia, where people are, sure, they're doing economically better, which in itself is a bit of an issue that we need to look at here. But from a social connection perspective, there's no reason why we could not be achieving that here.
Rachel, what's your take on maybe the need for a longer term approach, and what would be the benefits from your point of view?
I mean, the government's strategy around resettlement, I think, is the intention is for it to be a long-term approach to settlement. I think probably where it gets restricted is that the funding outside of government is only for immediate short-term. So the first 12 months of settlement is funded, but there's a lot of support in the community that's provided that is unfunded, that, if you want to implement that strategy long-term, you need to look at a wider funding pattern to ensure there's the services there. I think that in terms of longer term, it comes back a little bit to how you measure integration and whose metrics. So government measures it in one way, which is completely different to how an individual who's actually experiencing resettlement will measure it. So the concept of integration is quite a complex, multi-dimensional, it's very subjective in terms of how do you know when someone is integrated, how do you know when somebody has settled. And I quite like the concept of that integration occurs when the person who's on the journey has reached the destination that they want to reach, So that's a much different approach to, I guess, how we as settlement agencies and how government would often measure integration. So for instance, if you look at employment, so if we sort of say, well, how long does support need to be in place for achieving something like employment? So from a government or a settlement agency, we could measure it from when somebody gets a job, but we're basing that very much on an individual measurement. We're not measuring essentially, well, what's the labour market situation at the time, so there's other factors that need to be brought in about whether or not somebody got a job. But from the person's point of view, they are probably measuring it from, it's not just whether or not I've got a job, have I got a job that I find fulfilling, have I got a job that I actually want? And so, when we're looking at how much support needs to be in place, I think you want an inclusive community that has the services that people can access when they need to, and you want to recognise that successful refugee resettlement is actually quite unique to each person and each family. And if you're going to be able to rebuild the system completely from scratch, you'd want to completely wrap it around that individual as opposed to kind of high level targets and things like that. I mean, if I could wave an absolute magic wand and kind of, as opposed to saying how long should we be paying settlement agencies to do the support, like if you asked me that question, I'd say, look, make it at least 2 years, and that's a blimmin' good start. But if you could wave a magic wand, I'd say start, completely do a blank board, start from scratch, and let's look at it from how like Māori would do settlement. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could design refugee resettlement from Māori's perspective and actually start from there? And I imagine that we would have a completely different way of delivering settlement if actually, Māori were able to lead what settlement should look like and things like that. So, we could be a lot more creative than we are now as well.
What do you mean? Are there any specifics you could describe for us by a Maori approach?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of like a kaupapa Māori approach to settlement, if we recognise, what does it mean to be treaty partners in terms of welcoming people into the community, and actually what's Māori role in that. But if you can imagine what, the approach around in terms of caring for visitors, in terms of welcoming into community, if you started kind of said, actually, the first people who need to draw up this plan, we need to start, you know, Māori needs to lead this, and then government needs to follow. You know, I think it would be quite inspiring what plans could be drawn up in that space, and I imagine that it could be done completely differently. And I think things like caring for people, welcoming people, involving people into community possibly could be done in a different way.
I see you nodding, Tayyaba.
Yeah, look, I'm just really excited by all of the things that Rachel is saying. So it's fantastic to hear. And I think one of the real, I suppose, tangible practices that we could really look at in terms of tangata whenua is community development practices, right? How they build community and how they nurture community, and those that we are bringing into New Zealand would really relate to that. And so I think just that alone would be groundbreaking in terms of resettlement for former refugees.
And you kind of hope that there is a bit of a revolution in how resettlement occurs over time. You know, you know, I think we're doing better now than we have ever done in terms of refugee resettlement. Even the fact that we have an across government strategy is fantastic. I mean, funding of, you know, the service that we're currently leading at the moment, but, you know, that's only been funded fully since 2014. That's not a long time when you think how long refugees have been resettled. So, you know, you're seeing an incredible amount of improvements in the last 10 years in settlement, but you kind of hope that in another 10 years that you want to look back and see it looking completely different again. Because, you know, if this was the disability sector or even a kaupapa Māori organisation, you wouldn't expect to see, at the moment I'm leading the resettlement work and I'm sitting here as a white Kiwi, you want to kind of see in the future that actually refugee resettlement is being led by people who have lived experience of the resettlement and that sort of side of things. So, you know, I imagine that in years to come, we'll look back and kind of go, gosh, that was strange that the refugee resettlement program was run by a white woman, you know, and while host community needs to be part of the resettlement process, absolutely, my hope is that we continue to get better and we continue to, you know, move into an approach where you have a much stronger input from tangata whenua, you have much more leadership and delivery of services by refugee-led organisations. And, you know, that's, so we can talk about things like should support be extended? Absolutely, there should be more resource, without a doubt. If, you know, change it now to 2 years immediately to do that would be fantastic. But you actually want to make those big revolutionary changes that I think would give us more depth and quality overall.
Wow. I mean, we could say exactly the same for many services, like, I mean, our own service, you know, absolutely, it should be refugee-led as well. So just tootling along a little bit here, I'm not looking at the clock and it's moving quickly. So Res New Zealand undertook a survey of New Zealanders' perceptions of refugees this year. And while 56% agreed we should accept refugees, less than half believe refugees contribute positively or integrate successfully. So what do you want non-refugee Kiwis to better understand about people from refugee backgrounds who resettle in New Zealand? Either one. I mean, Rachel, go for it.
I mean, those stats aren't surprising. There was some research done a couple of years ago that had something around about 24% of people thought the refugee quota was over 10,000 people coming in each year. So you know, people just often don't have the information, they don't know the details. And around about that same time, another survey showed, and it was nearly 50% of people surveyed believed that there was the possibility that terrorists might come through the refugee quota. You know, so people didn't have the information about how safe the quota is in the screening. People didn't have the information about the number of people who are actually coming into the country. And so that shapes people's views. And the fact that we're only settling in a very small number of communities across the country means that most people haven't even had the experience of meeting somebody who has a refugee background. So they don't even have that social connection to shape their views and their understanding. But I mean, what I would want people to know is that resettlement works. It saves people's lives and it makes New Zealand a better place. And it's been occurring for 40 years. And so actually the fabric of our society is woven with people who have come through the refugee quota, and they are the people that you receive your health services from, who build your buildings, who lay the roads, who look after your children, who teach at university. And so our community is better off because of that. And so I think if people have the information and they can have, you know, the real life experience of connecting with people who have come through the refugee quota, you know, that will build confidence in refugee resettlement.
What are your thoughts, Tayyaba?
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage people to participate in Red Cross's voluntary program, right? Great way to support former refugee communities. But I also think we need to stop giving way to views that are actually negative versus really propping up views that are helpful and informative. So Rachel's touched on something that I think is really critical, which is so many people are misinformed. And so how can we make sure that we're using our own platforms to inform people with facts rather than, you know, conspiracy theories or inaccurate information? That's become really important in today's world. So I think that's a very basic thing we could all be doing, sharing information that's actually really, really accurate. I do think there are a lot of people that people might have crossed paths with, but, you know, not everyone's wearing the I am a refugee label for you to kind of, you know if they are or they aren't, and we don't expect that. I also think we need a reframe of our idea of what is, you know, what is a successful contribution. We seem to think that, you know, the model minorities is what we need to expect from all former refugees, and that in itself is not very helpful. So yeah, I think those would be the things I say. One, we could all do, which is to actually support people who are, you know, who are sharing good information out there and really giving that the platform. Two, encouraging people to actually volunteer for the Red Cross program. And three, we need to kind of reframe our own views around what success looks like, so that, you know, people are feeling like they are successful. And stories of integration are being shared more broadly than just what looks like the model minority.
Thanks for the plug for the volunteer program. Please, everybody go to our website.
So this is kind of related. How can local communities support people from refugee backgrounds settling in New Zealand? And are there any other overseas models which we could learn from? Rachel, how about you kick us off?
I mean, I guess from our viewpoint, we provide that first 12 months of support. And so the thing we're always asking communities to do is, you know, to get involved, first of all, like Tayyaba was saying, but to be the welcoming, to be connecting, to, you know, provide opportunities for people to be involved. And I think where the gaps always end up being is access issues. So, you know, you really want parents who are settling in New Zealand to be able to connect and engage with their school, but often language is a barrier, or, you know, that, or just not knowing how to get connected with other parents in the school and that sort of side of things. So it's around, you know, I think if communities can be thinking about the stuff that they're doing that build connection and bonds in their local community, how is that accessible to people who are new to our community, makes a, you know, massive difference. And then probably just building on what Tayyaba was saying, just those positive stories, you know, getting it out into the, you know, into the local community, you know, newspapers and all that sort of side of things, about speaking positively about refugee resettlement frames the story differently. And I think that, you know, really helps. In terms of overseas models, I mean, obviously I feel really biased, but every time I look at things overseas, I find myself thinking, oh, we totally do that better in New Zealand. So, you know, there's some places that put more emphasis on education and have people in English for longer. There's other places, you know, that throw people into employment straight away, but, you know, often that seem to limit people's development employment later on. I think New Zealand does really well with the orientation that we have, the Mangere Centre. You know, I think there's a bit, you know, there's a decent balance between language and employment. I think New Zealand does really well in terms of some of the language and the rhetoric, and I think that's being pushed by organisations like, you know, refugee background community-led organisations who have kind of, you know, encouraged everybody to be using the right language and that sort of side of things. But I think that the using the right language shapes the conversations in an important way. So I think New Zealand does that quite well. I mean, probably the big difference in terms of what we see overseas is that a lot of overseas settlement is actually just funded better than New Zealand is. So, you know, there's funding past the 12 months. And that there's funding at government levels to make sure that there's a you know, greater accessibility into government support and that kind of sort of side of things. Yeah.
What do you think host communities could do better, Tayyaba?
Yeah, so I'll keep it short, and I'll just talk about two things, and I'll plug in Belong Aotearoa's work here. You know, a while back they hosted cultural dinners, which was, you know, bringing people together to a table and eating food together. And I think something as basic as that, you know, goes a long way. So more initiatives like that would be so helpful. And secondly, I think it would be so great to see more initiatives that that create relationship building between former refugee communities and tangata whenua. You know, whether that's accessing maraes, or actually just, you know, meeting Māori and creating opportunities for them to learn about the history of this country. I think that would be, those two things would be critical from my perspective. And I look, in terms of just overseas models, I completely want to support what Rachel has said around the funding. It is really important that we start looking at better resourcing the sector at large, the organisations that do this work. They kind of, you know, it's not well funded in terms of the work that's expected and the funding that's provided to organisations.
And maybe the other thing is also, in terms of what local communities can do, is the very first new settlement location that was set up for a very long time, since another one had occurred, was in Dunedin. And we saw this complete switch in how City Council approached resettlement. And the Dunedin City Council, led by Dave Cull at that point, he was strongly involved. They set up a working group. The council led it. They wanted to lead the welcomes. They set up consultation groups with the families when they arrived. They put council funding into interpreting services. It was this very, very active involvement that then, I think, enabled other people in the community to get involved. So, you know, what can local communities be doing if we can see leadership from local councils? That's, I think, has been shown to be incredibly effective.
Yeah, sounds like it really does need to be a collaborative approach. And that brings me to my next topic in a way. So I'm sure you'd agree that long-term integration requires inclusive government policies. It also requires people from refugee backgrounds being at the decision-making table. What can we in New Zealand, and maybe we're talking about the government here, I'm not sure, but also organisations, be doing better to ensure true collaboration? And I see there's a question in the Q&As about how do we ensure that we get you know, people from refugee backgrounds in the CEO positions and management positions.
This is your expertise, Tayyaba. I'm going to throw the ball to you first.
I guess it comes down to, you know, we can consult and consult and consult, but it's not until we collaborate that we're going to be truly inclusive.
Yeah. And I think we need to look at this issue from a bird's eye view and a bit more strategically. And so, look, I'm gonna quote Sue Elliott here. I was reading a paper of hers, and of course, you know, hold her in high regards, where she talks about how, you know, it's worrying that even in the implementation priorities that were set for 2020, you know, that there are issues around funding. So that means that actually there's very little room for agencies outside of government to advocate to government around what's really needed. And in a system that has got, you know, a level of inherent structural discrimination going on, it makes it harder then to actually talk about what are the solutions to addressing those very issues. Employment being one, and I'll take it down to a very personal level. You know, I have lived in New Zealand for 29 years now. And this is the only country where I struggle on the employment front. You know, I've had lots of issues around landing jobs here, and I don't want to say I'm fantastic, but I also think that we need to really look at how we view accessibility for people to get into places of employment, and what's really going on there. So if I can struggle, well, I can only imagine what happens for communities who've also got a raft of other things going on that they need to deal with before they can feel like they're going into applying for roles that they really, really aspire to. So we do need to start having conversations around the bias that exists within the system, and how do we kind of shift those conversations, and create space for people to feel like they can actually participate. In the light of big movements like Black Lives Matter, what it's done is that it's popularized something that people from minority backgrounds have been raising for a very long time. This isn't a conversation that's new, that's been happening for a very, very long time. But those people we've marginalized, outcasted, we've actually put them to the side. And now that this is a popular conversation, I would really encourage people to go back to those very people and acknowledge that actually this problem has existed in this country for a very, very long time. And until we can do that, it would be very hard to actually make people feel like in their longer term settlement, they can fully thrive. I also think this is why people go to Australia, you know, bigger population groups, lesser experience of that structure. And Australia is, you know, I'm not saying it's a role model in terms of how it treats minority communities, but people do find their way in the system a lot better in Australia than they do here. And I'm an example of that as well. So yeah, I think those are the issues that we need to look at more strategically to be able to talk to government about it, and shift the dial.
Mm. And some of that is, how do you bring those voices to the forefront, isn't it? So, and even very practical things that people can do around following people on Twitter, Facebook. So we're actually listening and learning from people who have, you know, had refugee experiences in the background. So we, you know, if we're going to have genuine and equal partnerships with people, actually, you know, listening and learning and giving space for people to be having those conversations. Probably, I mean, at a high strategic level, you know, it would be good to see government actually building into the strategy some measurements around the host community engagement and that community development and that building. You know, what contribution can government be making to ensure that there's space to see leadership, for, you know, refugee background leadership finding its place in the right parts of the sector and things like that. So at the moment, everything's measured from the settlement strategy based on an individual output on an, you know, it's all measured, and so then all the resources tailored to those indicators that are very individual. You know, so has a person found a job, has a person gone to a doctor, versus actually how do we measure the environment or the community that people are coming into. And actually, if we know that building social capital and bridging relationships with others is important, why don't we measure how the community is doing in that? Why do we put all the emphasis on the individual to achieve, which, like Tayyaba says, just, you know, the massive pressure that there is on people in resettlement, and then we're asking them to do all these other things like take leadership roles and, you know, look after their communities and do everything else as well. You know, we should put some pressure on the host community as well and start measuring that too.
So do you think, you know, we talk about a whole of government approach to things. My experience is that that's lacking. What is the government's role in some of these areas?
In some of which particular?
In terms of these encouraging, improving the resettlement program, the outcomes, but also this approach to collaborative decision making.
Well, I mean, if it can be led from, I mean, if you can have government driving some of that, then that's fantastic, because when government drives it, you're going to, you know, the resources are going to follow it, which is what often is needed. But the voice you want shaping the conversation is probably more from the community. It's just that the community can't follow that up with resourcing, which is the difficult thing, you know. So it's, you know, you don't want to, you know, you want it to be collaborative. You want government input. You want it driven by community. You want sector experience. It really does, you know, in an ideal world, it should be all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And look, I think the government has a significant role to play, or all of government has a significant role to play in terms of what the system eventually looks like and feels like in terms of user experience, if I can put it crudely, I suppose. And so there's a huge responsibility on government. We are talking about, being a signatory so that we get people coming into this country. And that means we have a moral obligation in terms of their settlement process and what, how well we're doing in relation to that. So if we're not doing it collaboratively, what we're actually doing is ineffectively using resources. And we see that, right, in terms of organizations that are formed, but then they're not funded well. And so, or people doing the same thing, but not being able to come together. Those are the issues I think that we could kind of dissipate if there was an approach from government in terms of, these are the things that are important. Let's get you all together at a table and have that discussion. I mean, at the moment, the only formal mechanism for something that allows for everyone to come together and engage is the National Refugee Resettlement Forum, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's once a year. Where actually variety of stakeholders are invited. There's a theme that's set, and then people are asked to present on that. And so if that is the only way throughout the lifespan of the settlement process that we're looking at how collaboration might be happening, that's not enough.
I think we'd agree with you. I've just got a couple more questions before we go to the Q&A. So I think it's fair to say that the world's pretty much in turmoil at the moment. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. We're currently witnessing the sentencing in Christchurch after the attack. We're experiencing Black Lives Matter protests, the rise of the alt-right, and an increase in anti-migrant sentiment. What do you think we can do as a nation, as individuals, to show our support for minority groups who are negatively impacted by these issues?
So this is probably the hardest question for me, Anne. And I think it's because the lived experience suggests that it is kind of getting worse than better in terms of intolerance. And that's a real shame, right? And so you go back to the good old wonderful cliches of learn to be kind, be open, be open to getting to know others without fearing the other, even before you've kind of had any experience or exposure to. And I actually just think we need to start creating social media or media platforms where we're sharing the positive stories and we're sharing diverse stories and we're sharing good information versus the very negative, information that we see en masse. And we're so reliant on overseas content in terms of what shapes our views of minority communities. So not just former refugees, but minority communities at large. And we need to shift that if we want to change things here in New Zealand.
Yeah, I think that that storytelling, that shifting the narrative, yep, absolutely. And probably what we've both said before about passing the mic to people who need to be, who should be leading the conversations and making sure the right voices are being heard. And then, I mean, just being unrelenting with anything we can do, any actions that we can take that are addressing racism. I think whether that's our own individual journeys on that or our organisational journeys that we have to go on to, look at those issues through to then challenging out in the wider community. Yeah.
I can see lots of good questions that we need to get to, but I've got one more provocative question to ask you. So there are 26 million refugees in the world, according to Unhcr. Last year, only 107,000 of those were resettled in a third country. So what is the future of resettlement globally and locally? Should we be aiming for a resettlement, or do we need to find another alternative?
I think those numbers are even higher than, in reality. I think the settlement through quotas was only about just over 60,000 last year, and I think that additional number might be complementary pathways, but it's been decimated. And I mean, that's in short, is, you know, the global refugee resettlement program has been decimated, and it's going to, I mean, this year only 10,000 people have departed. I mean, that's partly COVID, but it's also because of the number of refugee quotas that have been reduced, and largely in the US. That's been, you know, that's been the big change. And you know, there's been the questions in over the last 3 years in particular, should we still have a global refugee resettlement program when so much funding goes into what is essentially a very small number of people? Of course, we know that even, you know, no matter what the number is, that has a ripple effect. It provides an anchor in a safe country, that provides support for other people still in the situation. We know it makes political impacts that then improve situations in host asylum countries of asylum, things like that. So there's absolute benefit. But certainly the message that I felt I heard from Unhcr, when I think there was a lot of concern about should we even have a refugee resettlement program, was I think it was Volker Turk who kind of said, be calm, we've been here before. This is, you know, this is because of political change. This is because of, you know, issues around global solidarity and geopolitical situations. Be calm, we've been here before, we will come through this and things will improve, you know. But it's this kind of, you know, without global solidarity, without political will, it won't improve. So, I mean, I think we're in a very, it's a dire situation for resettlement at the moment, and we just have to hope that things will improve, because resettlement remains a very valid and a very important solution, well, you know, contributing to solution around refugee resettlement issues, refugee issues.
Yeah, and I think what I would add to that is it's really important to reflect on why so many people are actually displaced in the world, you know, the root causes of it. And when you think about that, you need to think about, I suppose, what is each and every single person's responsibility around changing what we've created in the world. So without taking away the responsibility from first world nations around supporting refugee resettlement, which, you know, I think needs to continue and is essential, we do need to think about alternatives given the numbers and the protracted situation in refugee camps and so forth. You know, there is room for alternative solutions to be considered, but it is really also important that, you know, first world countries look at actually supporting the resettlement program in bigger ways. At the moment, it is really the third world countries that they take on and support so many of the people that are forced out from, you know, their homelands. So I think it's it's an issue that we need to consider from a strategic perspective without taking away the responsibility of countries, you know, who can be doing more. I understand that obviously with COVID and the economic situation, that's going to have an impact. And as Rachel mentioned, you know, the refugee resettlement programs across the world have been, you know, have taken cuts, but we need to think about what's priority. And if people are priority, then we prioritize this.
So we've got a really simple question, I think. Well, the first bit's simple. And probably we should have started with this, so apologies to the audience. What is the current refugee quota, and how is this number proportionally compared to other countries? Rachel, can you answer that for us?
It's actually not an easy answer. Technically, it's as of the 1st of July, it was 1,500. But because there's no arrivals at the moment, you know, 1,500 people won't be arriving this year. Last year it was 1,000. I think we had about, was it 780 or something around that number arrived. Yeah, proportionately, we're still taking very small numbers, even by per capita. We don't, you know, we're still not rating even in the top 20. I think we're quite a way down the list. So it's a meaningful quota. I mean, there's weight to it in the sense of what the quota is made up of, composition-wise, even the fact that we have medical cases, disability cases in, that it's consistent, that it's been a long-term quota, but it still remains, you know, a very small quota. Yeah.
And compared to other countries, you said we're rank about 20.
Oh, no, sorry, we're not even in the top 20.
We're not in the...
I don't even know where we are actually now per capita, but we're certainly not. In terms of numbers, we don't rank high at all. In terms of quality of resettlement, it has a lot of strong protection, our quota, so people get permanent residency on arrival. And, you know, flights are paid for and things like that. So there's a lot of protection mechanisms that other quotas don't have, and the fact that we do things like medical cases and that. So the quality of our resettlements is very good in comparison. But yeah, numbers wise, we still rate quite low, even with the increase to the quota. And, you know, we can only kind of celebrate the increase to the quota for so long. You know, we've sort of, you know, obviously the increase to the quota, the increase to the family support category, the extension of the community sponsorship program, you know, even the offer we've made to Australia, but technically none of that's happened. So, you know, we've still got a way to go until we actually are making a difference in terms of the numbers coming in.
There's just one other question that's kind of related. What other countries help help new refugees longer than 1 year?
I mean, Australia is probably the closest example. They have 2 tranches of funding. They do 2 years and then they have a 5-year funding as well. And so sometimes it's the same provider and sometimes that's different. Some of the Scandinavian countries, they do much longer than 1 year. But then on the other end of the scale, you have the US, who will do like kind of 3 months of support.
Okay. Tayyaba, this question's for you. Given the conflict between some communities, sometimes people outside those communities can play a role in bridging communication. What advice do you have for allies in this space?
Yeah, well, look, being an ally is really important, right? Rather than being the person who exacerbates the issue. So I think the solution here is to really raise the awareness of this very issue, which is that communities can have conflict. It is very normal. And so how do we support communities to actually resolve those conflicts rather than exacerbate them, given that we are a small country, people are likely to cross paths with each other, they're likely to actually go for similar jobs or, you know, operate in similar social networks, and it just exacerbates that experience of not feeling safe and the toxicity. So allies can play a pivotal role in educating everyone else around how they can ensure that those issues are minimized. And I think that's really, really important for us here in New Zealand.
This is changing tack completely, but I think it's quite an important question. How do you feel about the pressure that WINZ puts on former refugees to get work, despite not having enough English to do so?
Yeah.
So I'll, you know, really passionate about this issue. Okay, well, look, firstly, WINZ does this to everyone. It's not just former refugees, and this is not to minimize the experience, but it is the reality of the approach. And so this is where it's so important that organizations are funded to advocate, to change certain systems that are just not working. If you're applying a very black and white tool to how you assess someone's kind of ability to do something, then you're missing the component of the story in it. And so a lot of people struggle with that. I mean, WINZ went through a whole process where they kind of took all of their, you know, forms online without taking into consideration that we are talking about communities where digital literacy might actually be at a lower level, let alone whether they have, you know, internet at home or, yeah, all of that. So we are talking about an agency that isn't taking into consideration a lot of factors around what works for people that access that agency. And that needs to shift, and organizations can play a pivotal role in advocating for that.
I mean, the other thing that adds to that is, you know, that MSD has in the past, is it's 5 years now funded the Pathways to Settlement national program, and that's certainly based on a development journey. So I know while sometimes in the the MSD service centre level we see a lot of that individual push to move people on from English classes into work, but certainly at a national level MSD is committed to the long-term approach of developing and giving people space to learn the language and get training and then finding the right type of work. So I think we've seen another really positive shift in that part of government, and here's hoping that will bring really positive outcomes for the community long term.
Another question here is around support for access to services. This one relates specifically to the health sector, but I think from my experience anyway, access to services generally is a big issue. What more could the health sector be doing to improve access for refugee background clients and families?
Oh, I mean,
and I'm happy for you to expand that beyond health.
Yeah, I mean, language assistance. I mean, I had a conversation with somebody who ran the maternity sector in a hospital, and I was trying to explain why they needed to use interpreters during the birth, and they said, well, we've only got this amount of hours, which part of the birthing process should we interpret? And you're sort of thinking, like it was, you sort of have these ridiculous conversations with people about, so the health system needs, we've come across amazing practitioners in the health system who work really hard to ensure access issues are addressed, and what we want to see is that approach being taken across health as a whole, that it should be an absolute given that you can come in and use you have access to an interpreter, and that practitioners receive cultural training and are operating from a culturally competent learning platform.
Tayyaba, have you got some thoughts on access to services?
Yeah, look, I think right now the responsibility around making access accessible to services is heavily reliant on the communities, and we see that a lot. So if you're a part of the community, you tap into your community organizations that are informally set up, or members of your community, to actually understand what you can do to kind of access the system. And so we've got this kind of inherent imbalance as well, where you've got community groups who are trying to make sure that they are doing their bit to make things accessible, and we need to acknowledge that within the system and acknowledge that service within the system. But I also think Rachel touched on a very critical point: language. We see language in a very in kind of like a one-dimensional way, and language is actually so much more complex. So for example, we might just create a flyer, we might translate it into different languages, and we put it out there in terms of here's how you access the service, but actually there are people who might not be literate, or who might be semi-literate in their languages, so that creates an issue around whether they have fully comprehended the services that are available to them. So I almost think we need a better bridging around service providers and communities to be able to actually make services more accessible. And we need to go back to the traditional models, which seem really archaic now in the digital world, but people actually respond so much better to information when someone's just called them up, or if they've actually shared that information in person. And so we do need to think about those approaches in terms of the services that we deliver.
Mm-hmm. We're really running out of time, but I've got, this is an interesting question. Well, I think it's interesting. Do you think having more settlement locations and additional settlement service providers, example, Timaru and Ashburton, is positive or negative to achieve better outcomes for former refugees?
If having more settlement providers, did you say, is...
It's both more locations and more providers.
I mean, more locations, absolutely. The more communities that can be involved in settlement, the more people have interaction, absolutely, 100%. More service providers, I think we've never seen it before, so I'm kind of interested to see you know, what the positive benefits are going to be, because you hope that if there's more people who are delivering the service, then you're going to build a bigger community of people and organisations who are involved, who are going to have different networks and different ways of operating. So, you know, we're talking to the other service providers, and we're kind of really looking forward to seeing how they do things, because we're so used to how we do it. You kind of think, cool, a couple more people on the block, you're going to get new ways of doing things, and you've got to hope that that brings more innovation into the way things happen. So, I mean, I think it should be positive. It should open up a whole lot of new networks, a whole lot of new ways of doing things. And, you know, here's hoping in a couple of years we look back and go, God, that was really worth it. That worked out well.
Any final comments? Because sadly, we're not going to get to all the questions, all the comments in the chat room. Any final comments from either of you?
None from me. Look, I thank you so much for the opportunity, to you, Anne, and also to Raz and Zed for inviting me along.
Well, thank you to you both. Honestly, it's just been a fantastic conversation. It's so important for us to have these conversations and to be talking about these issues. Thank you both so much for your time. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for all the experience you've brought to our conversation this afternoon. I also just want to say thank you to all the audience for hanging in there with us through the whole of the symposium. We're now at the end of our webinar series. It's been an absolute privilege talking with so many different groups and people, and thank you for your contributions, for your questions. And just know that these are recorded. They're available on our website, so you're more than welcome to go back and catch up on any you may have missed. But from all of us here at RES New Zealand, thank you all so much for your support for our work and for our symposium. And we look forward to continuing to work with you. Thanks, everybody.